we don't come from a culture that has a cuisine. I mean, you can cook all you want at home, but if you're not putting the pieces together, which is what cuisine is. I mean, again, cooking at home means you can go to the farmer's market this summer and grab that zucchini and that onion and that tomato and call yourself, a responsible farm to table, ecological home cook. But that doesn't really mean anything if you're not putting the pieces together of what makes a farm truly healthy and sustainable, which is to say that Japan may be a rice culture, but to grow rice for thousands of years, you needed buckwheat. Because buckwheat broke up disease cycles. And the only way to get a rice crop was to plant buckwheat and barley, but mainly buckwheat. So what did the Japanese do? Well, they didn't have Dan Barber wagging their finger and saying, you better eat buckwheat. They created soba noodles. And so part of the Japanese cuisine is that you eat rice, twice a day, but you also eat your buckwheat and soba noodles once or twice a week because it's delicious and it's part of what it means to be Japanese. But it also it started with an agricultural dictate, which was that you had to. Now, that example, which I sort of took more or less off the cuff, you could replicate that example, just name the country. I mean, look at Mexico. Mexico may be a corn or global south, maybe corn as its major crop in the way that wheat is the crop for the Western Hemisphere and rice is for Asia. But in the Southern Hemisphere, while corn was king crop, you couldn't get corn without beans. You needed the nitrogen to grow that corn stalk. So beans are just as important to Southern foodways. It goes on and on. There are all these crops that are absolutely essential, basically to soil health, but really to get you the crop that is your king crop, that is your identifiable cultural crop. Often there's a slew of crops that you need because you need diversity. And that's where cuisine comes in. And so cuisine looks so different in these different areas because the environment, the ecological dictates is dictating what to grow when to get a certain crop, which is figured out over thousands of years. And that's why cuisine is so beautiful because it doesn't make demands of you. It inculcates itself into the everyday norms and mores of a culture. And that becomes who you are as a person, actually. It's totally identifiable with who you are. In America, we never had any of that. Nothing, zero. We came here and we threw a seed into the ground and it was the Garden of Eden. It was like a fucking miracle. When people talk about California cuisine, it drives me nuts. What the hell is California cuisine? It's a bunch of products. It's not cuisine. Cuisine is you take the crops you actually don't want to use and you make them beautiful. And that's the history of every culture that at least lasted till today look at French culture. You think of French as high-end food. It's crazy. It's peasantry everywhere. Bouillabaisse. What is bouillabaisse? It's damaged, smelly fish on the dock that the wives had to cook for the fishermen while they were out selling the beautiful loins. And bouillabaisse became the trash fish. It was a wasted fish dish. It's a coq au vin. What's coq au vin? Coq au vin is a rooster. It's a male bird that is about as easy to eat as the wood on the table that I just tapped. But you take that and you marinate it in white wine and you cook it very gently with the acid of white wine and you get one of the most delicious flavors imaginable. And that is what coq au vin is. Every example that we think of today with cuisine comes from the relationship between good agriculture and good farming, good agriculture, good farming, and good food. And that's what we need. And getting back to your question, that's the Herculean task for Americans because we do not have that as a backdrop in our DNA. We never had that. We arrived at the Garden of Eden. And we have been up until this day, one of the more wasteful food cultures in the history of the world. And when the soils on the East Coast collapsed, which they did in the great soil crisis of the 1800s, the early 1820s, with soils absolutely almost overnight collapsed, what happened? Farmers dropped their plows and they moved to the Midwest. And with the help of the government and the Homestead Act, they plow up the prairie and they plant what? Wheat. And then when that crisis hits next and the wind blows the soil all around, they keep moving west. And we call it manifest destiny, but it was chasing healthy soil. But what's interesting about that is what happened to those that were left behind on the East Coast? Well, they were largely slave owners and slaves. And what happened on the great Southern food economy, which was the greatest in the world, it was an export food economy. We were exporting rice to Indonesia and China in the early 1800s. And then the soil collapsed. The great soil crisis happened. And the ones who were left behind, slave owners and slaves themselves, had to figure out, because they couldn't go to the Midwest, they had to figure out, how do we return soil fertility to a land and to a culture that never knew anything about fertility? Well, North Africans and West Africans certainly did. And so slaves brought their rotation crops and their farming practices to the culture of Southern farming. And that's how you got collard greens, for example, because collard greens thrive in salinic soils. Well, the soils were so degraded and so filled with salt that you had to rotate in crops like collard greens, but also sweet potatoes, which broke up disease cycles. And so you got this unbelievable introduction of variety and, very importantly, this meticulously timed way to rotate these crops that were called rotations, and that became a mirror image in the cuisine, which is Southern cuisine, the great California rice kitchen, Creole kitchens. Everything that came out of that came from a desperation to return fertility to the soil. So that you had dishes like Hoppin' John's. Hoppin' John's is not a bowl of rice, which it was before 1820. It became 50% rice, but 50% cowpeas. Cowpeas was an inedible pea, supposedly, before 1820. Well, then they realized that cowpeas give the best nitrogen fixation in the soil, and you need to eat cowpeas, actually, if we're going to have a rice crop, just like you need to eat buckwheat for rice. So cowpeas and rice became the fundamental, peas and rice became the fundamentals of Southern cuisine. You had Hoppin' John's, 50% cowpeas, 50% rice, and you didn't have a big loin of pork. You had some pork fat back because you could produce that much pig, and you stretch the pig and let that infuse into this dish, and on and on. The dishes of Southern, by the way, the only cuisine we call American food, Southern food. And that's because it arose out of this calculation between how do you survive calorically and how do you improve the soil beneath your feet to give you another crop. That's the only example we have in this country of a cuisine. And that's why Southern food has lasted forever, because it's so delicious, but it makes so much ecological and cultural sense.